So we are going to just quickly go over the laws and the rules of the laws of the Omer, which we covered in the past week in the Mishna Berurah based on the Shulchan Aruch. So number one, we start the second night of Pesach. It's best to recite the Omer as early as possible before Aleinu in order to accomplish what the Torah writes complete days. But you do have the entire night to recite it with a blessing, as we will talk about in another slide. Although women technically have no obligation, they may recite the blessing if they choose to, and they may count and recite the blessing with no problem. If you are Sephardi, a woman of Sephardic heritage, then perhaps you should recite it without a blessing. One must recite the blessing by oneself and not have someone recite it for you. This being said, it is always the best case to recite the blessing together with the congregation. As you know, the bigger, the better. The idea of Berurah Hadras Melech, in a bigger congregation, the more glory is brought to the king. The blessing and the count should be recited standing. You are supposed to recite the day and the week. If you do the following: recite the day only, you should repeat it that night without a blessing. If you recited the week only, if it's on the full week, you should repeat it without a blessing, meaning if it's on, if you said tonight is 2 weeks, then you should recite without a blessing, as that's apparent from the Mishna Berurah. If it's any other, it seems from the Mishna Berurah that you do not complete your mitzvah, and therefore you should repeat it with a blessing. However, I'm not 100% sure, so if that's the case, you should perhaps ask your local Orthodox rabbi. Now we're on to the next day. One should wait until it is nightfall to recite the Omer with a blessing. Nightfall is what you wait for Shabbat to go out. Now, if you are at evening prayers, which starts after sunset but before nightfall, as many congregations do act on, you may recite the Omer with a blessing. It is best to recite it again after nightfall without a blessing to make sure that you recited it at least at the proper time, which would be after night. If one prays with a minyan before nightfall, after sunset, he may wait until nightfall to recite the blessing on his own. He does not have to answer, he does not have to recite it together with the congregation. If he answers the main to the Chazin's blessing of the Omer or the rabbi's blessing of the Omer, he should be careful to have in mind not to fulfill the obligation with the Chazin, then go home and after nightfall recite it by himself with the blessing. When one is informing another what count of the Omer is that night, if it is after sunset and has yet to recite the Omer himself, he should not say the number of the night. Rather, he should say the last night was, in order not to end up reciting the number of that night, and then he's no longer allowed to recite and count the Omer that night with a blessing. If he did say tonight is number whatever, and it is after sunset, he should recite the Omer without a blessing. One should not start eating if it is a time to recite the Omer. If he started, he should stand up, recite it, then he's allowed to continue his meal. If he started before sunset, he may continue the meal as long as there is time to still recite the Omer before day. Now we're on to the last one of this week. And it is best practice to know the count before one starts to recite the blessing. This will prevent many potential problems, as we will see. If one did not know the day at the time of the blessing and waits to find out from another, for example, he says the bracha, and is waiting for his friend next to him in synagogue to recite it, so he is informed of what the proper time the day is. He still fulfilled his obligation, even though it's not ideal. This is even if you waited more than 3 seconds from finishing the blessing and the counting of the day. Even though it's a long interruption, it's still going to count. However, as we said earlier, it's best to always know the day before the blessing. If one had the wrong day in mind during the blessing but ended up reciting the correct day, he fulfilled his obligation nevertheless. If one recited the wrong day, he has 3 seconds to correct oneself. It is more than 3 seconds, he must recite the blessing anew, meaning if one says, he recites the blessing, then he says, tonight is the 14th, then quickly he remembers it's really the 15th. If he says it is the 15th within 3 seconds, it's okay. If not, he has to recite the blessing all over again. When one does not correct himself in 3 seconds, he's not need to recite today is the 15th day. Rather, just say the number. But again, if he didn't catch himself within 3 seconds, he's got to do everything anew, and he should say the blessing and say tonight is the 15th night. If one forgot to count the Omer at night, he may recite it during the day without a blessing. That night, he may continue with a blessing. If one forgets to recite a whole day, he may no longer recount the Omer with a blessing. He should continue without a blessing. If he remembers being a shmashos, meaning if he went a whole day without counting it, and then he remembered after sunset, he should count as soon as possible with no blessing and continue the night with a blessing. This is only if he remembers it within 13 minutes, others say 25 minutes of sunset. If he catches himself within 25 or 13 minutes of sunset and he did not count the entire previous day, he still is allowed to count, of course, without a blessing, but that night he's allowed to continue with a blessing. If he's not sure if he counted, let's say someone decide he realizes he didn't remember if he counted yesterday, and it's already the new night, he may continue with a blessing. The reason is that in this case we have two doubts. Number one, he may have recited it, and number two, even if he did not recite it, some hold that the mitzvah, the obligation, is per day and not per the entire 49 days, and therefore, even if he forgot yesterday, he still could rely on them, and he still could count. Perhaps every day itself is his own mitzvah. This is known as sakseka and is applied in many halachos.